The year was 1887, and the silence on Esther Hale's farm had a weight to it. It was a physical presence, as tangible as the dust that settled on the mantelpiece over the cold hearth, or the worn grain of the wooden table where she ate her meals alone. For 2 years, since her husband Arthur had been taken by a fever that burned through him like a prairie fire, the silence had been her most constant companion. It echoed in the empty space beside her in the bed, in the unused chair by the fire, and in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory that stretched out from her porch in every direction. The land itself, with its sage-brushed hills and sky that was too big, too empty, seemed to hold its breath around her, mirroring the stillness in her own heart. Esther was a creature of routine, for routine was the only dam she had against the flood of grief. She rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose. She milked the lone cow, fed the chickens, tended the small vegetable patch that was her concession to the future. Her movements were economical, stripped of any wasted energy, her face often set in a mask of stoic neutrality that hid the hollowness within. The people in the nearby town of Redemption saw a capable widow, strong and unbending. They did not see the woman who sometimes stood in the middle of the barn, her hand pressed against the splintered wood of Arthur's workbench, and allowed a single, hot tear to trace a path through the grime on her cheek before she wiped it away with a rough hand. They saw resilience, but it felt like resignation. Men like Garrett Shaw, the portly merchant who controlled most of the town's commerce and all of its gossip, saw an opportunity. He would approach her in his store, his voice slick with false sympathy, suggesting she sell the farmstead. "It's too much for a woman alone, Esther," he would say, his eyes lingering on the land he coveted. "A respectable widow belongs in town, where she can be cared for." His words were a cage disguised as a kindness, and every time she heard them, something cold and hard knotted in her stomach. She was 32 years old, and society was already trying to put her on a shelf, another dusty relic of a life that was over. Her trips to Redemption were infrequent necessities, fraught with the averted gazes and whispered pities of the townsfolk. She endured them with a quiet dignity she did not feel, her shopping list a shield against unwanted conversation. On a sweltering afternoon in late August, she guided her wagon down the town's dusty main street, her mind on flour and salt and the pressing need to get back to the solitude that, while lonely, was at least honest. But the street was not its usual sleepy self. A crowd had gathered in the open square before Shaw's Mercantile, a rough circle of farmers, ranch hands, and curious townspeople. Their energy was coarse and ugly, a mix of cruel excitement and morbid curiosity. Garrett Shaw stood on a crate, his face flushed with self-importance. Beside him stood 2 armed men, and between them a figure that made Esther's breath catch in her throat. It was a man, tall and powerfully built, his skin the rich, sun-darkened copper of the Navajo people. His hands were bound tightly in front of him with thick rope, and his feet were shackled. But the most brutal detail, the one that seemed to suck the air from the square, was the rough burlap sack that had been pulled down over his head, completely obscuring his face and tied off at the neck. He stood perfectly still, a statue of contained force amidst the jeering crowd. Found wandering on Prescott land, Shaw bellowed, projecting his voice to the edges of the crowd. A stray, a vagrant, but look at the shoulders on him. The strength in that back, wasted potential, I say. He poked the man's bicep with a condescending finger. The man did not flinch. "I've spoken with the marshal. Rather than let him rot in a cell, we're offering a public service. Any man in need of hard labor, of a strong back to break on his fields, can have him. A contract for 1 year's work. Let's start the bidding at $5. A wave of revulsion washed over Esther. This was not an auction of property, it was a spectacle of dehumanization. It was a performance designed to reinforce the power of men like Shaw and to turn a human being into a beast of burden. The crowd laughed. A rancher shouted, $2, can't see what you're buying with that sack on his head. Another offered $3, with a crude joke about what other uses the man might be put to. The bids were insults, meant to degrade the man on the crate further. Esther stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the absolute stillness of the bound man, and in it she recognized a mirror of her own frozen existence. But his stillness was not resignation. It felt like a tightly coiled spring, a storm held in check. She thought of the condescending pity she received, the attempts to manage her life, and saw it magnified 1,000 times in the coarse burlap sack and the thick ropes. An impulse, fierce and foreign, surged through her. It was a rebellion against the smirking face of Garrett Shaw, against the town's casual cruelty, against the silent, grieving woman she had become. $1, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the din like a shard of glass. The crowd fell silent, heads turned, eyes widening in disbelief as they located the source of the bid. A woman, the widow Hale. Garrett Shaw squinted, then a slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "Esther, did you say something, dear lady?" She lifted her chin, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her basket. "I said $1. The crowd erupted in murmurs. It was an absurd bid, a woman's bid. It was an insult to the proceedings, too low to be serious. Shaw's amusement turned to irritation. He wanted a show of masculine dominance, a contest between landowners, not this interruption. He looked at the other men, but they were silent, staring at Esther. No one would bid against the grieving widow. It would be unseemly. Her absurd bid had impossibly won. Shaw's face soured. He had been outmaneuvered by a ghost. "Fine," he spat, the word dripping with contempt. "Sold, to the widow Hale, for $1. You've bought yourself a field hand, Esther. I hope you know what to do with him." He kicked the crate over and gestured for his men to hand the rope to her. The thick, rough rope was thrust into her hand. It felt heavy, like an anchor. The crowd parted as she walked forward, their stares a mixture of shock, scorn, and a new, unwelcome form of pity. She stopped before the man. He was even taller up close, his presence immense and unnerving. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could hear the soft sound of his breathing through the burlap. For a terrifying moment, she was paralyzed. What had she done? Then she met the challenge. She gave a small, firm tug on the rope. "Come," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He did not resist. He followed her, his shackled feet making a soft, dragging sound in the dust, a rhythm of subjugation that echoed through the silent town as she led him toward her wagon. The journey back to the farm was a long mile of suffocating silence. The man sat in the back of the wagon, as still as he had been on the crate, while Esther's mind raced. She had not acted out of a need for a laborer. Her small farm did not require a man of his formidable strength. She had acted from a place she did not recognize in herself, a place of sudden, sharp-edged clarity. She had seen an injustice and, without thinking, had stepped into it. Now, the consequence of that act sat behind her, a towering, unknown man with a sack over his head. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. He was a captive, a man stripped of his dignity. He could be filled with a rage as vast as the plains, and she had just brought him to her isolated home. When they arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, setting the sky ablaze. The familiar landscape of her farm suddenly looked alien, charged with a new and volatile energy. She tethered the horse and walked to the back of the wagon. The man had not moved. "You can get down," she said softly. He swung his legs over the side and landed with a soft thud, the chains on his ankles clinking. Her first instinct was to offer him a dipper of water from the well. He was a living creature, and it was a hot day. She worked the pump, the familiar squeak, a jarringly normal sound in the tense air. She held the dipper out to him. He remained motionless for a long moment before he shuffled forward and, with his bound hands, awkwardly took it. She watched the way his throat worked under the rough burlap as he drank. The sack was the next thing. It was an obscenity. She could not have him on her farm, could not look at him, while he wore that mark of another man's cruelty. "I am going to take that off your head," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I will not hurt you." She expected him to recoil, to resist. He did not. He stood utterly still as she reached up, her fingers fumbling with the rough knot at his neck. The burlap smelled of dust and sweat and something else, something like fear. She finally worked the knot free and, holding her breath, slowly lifted the sack away. The world seemed to stop. It was not love at first sight, not the foolish fancy of a lonely woman. It was something far more profound, something that struck her with the force of a physical blow. The face revealed was not the face of a savage or a beast. It was a face carved from the very earth around them, with strong cheekbones, a proud, straight nose, and a mouth that was set in a line of immense, unyielding endurance. But it was his eyes that undid her. They were dark and deep, and in their depths she saw a universe of pain, of loss, of fury, held so tightly in check it seemed to shimmer. He was not broken. He was captured, but he was fiercely, magnificently whole. In that one shattering moment, Esther Hale did not see a laborer or a problem or a danger. She saw a man whose soul was looking out at her from a prison of silence, and she felt an immediate, inexplicable kinship with the prisoner. Her own grief-stricken heart recognized the cage around his. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, assessing. She saw the question in his eyes. Was she just another captor, a different kind of jailer? Without a word, she turned and went into the house, returning with a small, sharp knife from her kitchen. She walked back to him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She held up the knife so he could see it. "Your hands," she whispered. She gestured toward the ropes binding his wrists. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. This was the true test. She could gut him where he stood. He watched her for a long, silent eternity. Then slowly, deliberately, he extended his bound hands toward her. With trembling fingers, she sawed at the thick rope. It was tight and had chafed his skin raw beneath. When the last strand parted, the rope fell away. He flexed his fingers, his wrists red and raw. He did not run, he did not attack. He simply stood there, his hands now free, watching her. Esther felt a wave of dizziness. She backed away, the knife still in her hand, and pointed toward the barn. "There is a loft," she said, her voice thin. "There are blankets. You can sleep there." He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked toward the barn, the sound of his ankle chains, a grim reminder of his incomplete freedom. Esther retreated into the safety of her house, locking the door behind her for the first time since Arthur had died. She sank into a chair, her body trembling, the image of his face burned into her mind. She had not bought a servant. She had brought home a storm. The first days passed in a state of suspended animation. A silent, cautious dance unfolded between the farmhouse and the barn. Esther would rise, do her morning chores, and then leave a plate of food, bread, cheese, a piece of smoked meat on the stump outside the barn door before retreating to the house. Hours later, the plate would be empty. She would see him sometimes from her window, a tall, imposing figure, moving with a quiet grace that belied the chains still on his ankles. The key to the shackles had been on Garrett Shaw's desk, a detail Esther had forgotten in her haste. She gave him no orders. She did not know what to say, how to bridge the chasm of language and experience that separated them. She simply observed. On the third day, she saw him studying the axe by the woodpile. Fear, sharp and metallic, tasted on her tongue. He could use that to split her skull as easily as a log. He picked it up, tested its weight, and then, with a fluid power that was mesmerizing to watch, he began to chop the wood she had been struggling with for weeks. He worked all day, never slowing, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a steady heartbeat in the farm's silence. He did not stop until the entire pile was split and neatly stacked, a bulwark of firewood that would see her through half the winter. That evening, instead of leaving the plate on the stump, she set it on the far end of her kitchen table. She left the door ajar and sat in her usual seat, her back to it, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She listened to the crickets, to the sound of her own breathing. After a long while, she heard the soft drag and clink of his approach. He paused in the doorway. She could feel his presence, his watchful gaze on her back. She did not turn. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then she heard him step inside, cross the floor, and pull out the chair at the opposite end of the table. The scrape of wood on wood was the loudest sound she had ever heard. They ate in absolute silence, two solitary souls separated by 6 feet of worn pine, together in their isolation. Slowly, cautiously, the ice began to thaw. The shared, silent meals became a nightly ritual. She learned the rhythm of his presence. One afternoon, a fierce wind kicked up, threatening to tear a loose shutter from the barn wall. Esther struggled with it, the wood bucking against her grasp. Suddenly, he was there, his large, warm hands closing over hers, steadying the shutter as he effortlessly hammered the pin back into place. Their fingers were tangled for a brief, electric moment. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her face flushed. He merely nodded and walked away. The key to his shackles became an obsession. It was a symbol of her failure, of his continued bondage. A week after his arrival, she hitched the wagon and drove back to Redemption, her stomach in knots. She walked into Shaw's Mercantile, her head held high. Shaw was behind the counter, a smug look on his face. "Come for more supplies, Esther, or have you tired of your purchase already?" he asked, his voice oily. "I came for the key," she said, her voice flat and cold. He feigned ignorance. "Key? What key?" "The key to the shackles. You will give it to me." Shaw laughed. "That's evidence. He's a prisoner of the territory, Esther. I did you a favor letting you work him. Those shackles stay on, for your safety, for the town's." A cold fury she didn't know she possessed rose in her. "He is on my land. He is under my care. He is not your prisoner anymore. Give me the key, Garrett, or I will go to the marshal in Cheyenne and tell him how you hold auctions for men in the street." The threat was emptith. Marshall would likely side with Shaw, but her tone was not. The look in her eyes was one he had never seen before. It was not the look of a grieving, breakable widow. It was the look of a landowner, a proprietor, a woman who would not be moved. Grumbling, he reached under the counter and slapped a heavy, rusted iron key onto the wood. "On your head be it," he snarled. She snatched the key and left without another word. The ride home felt triumphant. She found him by the creek, watching the water flow over the stones. She approached him quietly and held out the key. He looked from the key to her face, his expression unreadable. She knelt before him, the key cold and heavy in her palm. He sat on a rock and lifted his chained ankles. The lock was rusted and stiff. It took all her strength to turn the key. When the shackle finally sprang open, the sound was like an exhalation. He stood up, truly free for the first time since she had met him. He took a step, then another, his movements suddenly lighter. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "Bidziil," he said. The sound of his voice, low and resonant, startled her. It was the first word he had spoken to her. "Bidziil," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue. "It means he is strong," he said, his English slow and deliberate, but clear. That night, he did not just eat, he spoke. He told her not of his capture, that wound was still too fresh, but of the land where he was from, a place of red rock canyons and turquoise skies. He spoke of sheep and stories carried on the wind. Esther, in turn, found herself speaking of Arthur, not of his death, but of his life. Of the way he had laughed, of his dream to build this farm into something that would last. She spoke of the silence he had left behind. In the flickering lamplight of her small kitchen, two worlds, two griefs, began to touch, to overlap. The farm began to change. It was no longer a place of static survival, but one of shared work and quiet growth. Bidziil had a knowledge of the land that felt ancient and intuitive. He showed her how to find water where the willows grew thickest, how to read the clouds for signs of a storm. He repaired the sagging roof of the barn, his movements sure and efficient. In return, she taught him more English words, reading to him from Arthur's worn copy of Shakespeare, their laughter mixing in the small room when he tried to wrap his tongue around the strange, flowery language. A fragile sense of peace settled over them. Esther felt herself unfurling, like a plant turning toward the sun. The hollow space inside her was not gone, but it no longer echoed with despair. It was being filled with a new kind of quiet, a quiet of companionship, of shared presence. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the graceful economy of his strength, the deep concentration on his face. She would look up from her mending and find his eyes on her, a soft, watchful gaze that made her heart beat a little faster. But their sanctuary was an island in a hostile sea. The town of redemption had not forgotten. Their story had become a scandal, a dark rumor whispered over fences and in the pews on Sunday. The widow Hale was living with a savage. She was shamed or bewitched or had lost her mind to grief. Garrett Shaw stoked the flames, his pride wounded, his desire for her land now mingled with a venomous resentment. He saw her defiance as a threat to the town's rigid order. The threat materialized on a crisp October morning. Esther was in the chicken coop when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. Her blood ran cold. She stepped out to see 5 riders cresting the hill, Garrett Shaw in the lead. They were not paying a social call. They carried rifles across their saddles. Bidziil emerged from the barn, his face a mask of stone. He had heard them too. He moved to stand beside her, his presence a silent, solid wall. "Esther," Shaw called out, reining his horse to a stop a few yards away. His men fanned out behind him, their faces hard and grim. "We've come for the Navajo. The circuit judge is coming through next week. He'll want to know what happened to the prisoner." "He is not a prisoner," Esther said, her voice shaking but firm. She stepped slightly in front of Bidziil. "He is a free man, working on my land." "A free man?" Shaw scoffed, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "He's a menace. The women in town are scared. They say you're in danger. We've come to take him off your hands. For your own good." "I am in no danger from him," she shot back, her fear being burned away by a hot, protective rage. "The only danger I see is 5 armed men on my property, threatening a man who has done them no harm." "He is not a man, he is an Indian," one of the riders snarled. "And you're a disgrace, living out here with him." The words struck Esther, but they did not break her. She looked at Bidziil, at his proud, defiant stillness. She looked at the house she and Arthur had built, the land they had bled for. This was her home. He was part of it now. The thought was as clear and solid as the ground beneath her feet. "You are not welcome here, Garrett," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she had never known she possessed. "This is my property. Turn your horses around and leave now." Shaw's face darkened with fury. He had expected a frightened, hysterical woman. He had not expected this queen standing on her own soil. "We're not leaving without him," he said, dismounting. He started toward them, his men close behind. This was it, the moment the fragile peace would shatter. But Esther did not retreat. She stood her ground, her heart a wild drum in her chest. As Shaw advanced, Bidziil moved. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply took a step forward, placing himself between Esther and the approaching men. He did not speak. He did not have to. His sheer presence, his unshakable calm, his silent declaration that they would have to go through him to get to her, was more powerful than any threat. He was no longer a captive. He was a guardian. The sight of them, the small, fierce woman and the towering, immovable man, standing together as one, gave the riders pause. Their bluster began to fray at the edges. This was not going to be as simple as they thought. Seeing their hesitation, Esther made her move. She turned, strode briskly to the porch, and returned with Arthur's old hunting rifle. She did not point it at them. She held it cradled in her arms, a clear and final statement. "I will not say it again, Garrett," she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. "Leave." Shaw stared from the rifle to Esther's unblinking eyes, to the formidable man standing beside her. He saw that he had lost. The story he would tell in town would be one of a crazed widow, but here, in the clear light of day, he was just a bully who had been faced down. With a curse, he turned and stomped back to his horse. "This isn't over," he spat. His men, looking relieved, mounted up and followed him, kicking up dust as they galloped away. Esther stood watching them go, the rifle heavy in her arms, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. The silence that descended was different from any that had come before. It was not empty. It was filled with the deep, resonant hum of a victory shared, a line drawn and held. She turned to Bidziil. He was looking at her, and for the first time she saw the walls in his eyes crumble completely. What lay behind them was not anger or pain, but a deep, overwhelming gratitude and something more profound and tender respect that mirrored what she felt for him. She lowered the rifle, and he reached out, his hand gently covering hers on the warm wood of the stock. His touch was not a spark this time, it was a current, a connection that flowed between them, steady and strong. In the weeks and months that followed, a new life took root on the farm. The routines were the same, the milking, the mending, the tending, but they were no longer solitary acts of survival. They were shared rhythms, a life built together. They worked side by side in the garden, their hands in the same soil. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sky bruise into nightfall, the silence between them now a comfortable blanket, woven with understanding and unspoken affection. The town of redemption remained a distant, hostile shore, but it no longer had the power to touch them. Their farm had become their world, a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness by courage and kindness. Esther Hale was no longer the grieving widow, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. She was a woman who had found her strength, not in forgetting her past, but in building a new future. And Bidziil was no longer the captive with a sack on his head, a symbol of a town's prejudice. He was a man who had found a home in the most unlikely of places, with the most unlikely of people. He had found a partner who had looked at him and seen not a savage, but a soul. One evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to drift down from a slate-gray sky, they sat at the kitchen table. Esther looked across at him, at the proud, kind face that was now as familiar and dear to her as her own. The dollar she had paid felt like a lifetime ago. It was the single greatest bargain of her life. She had thought she was buying a man's labor, a desperate act of defiance. Instead, she had bought her own salvation. She had found a resilience she never knew she had, and in the heart of a harsh and unforgiving land, she had found love, quiet and steadfast, growing in the space where grief used to live. She reached across the table, and he took her hand, his strong fingers lacing through hers. Outside, the snow fell, blanketing the world in a pristine, hopeful silence.